imagine l'extrême soulagement de ceux qui ont été lavés de toute accusation. Ces hommes et ces femmes ont tenté de retrouver une vie normale et de récupérer au plus vite leurs enfants placés depuis le début de l'affaire. Agnès Gardet, Frédéric.
Le procès Outreau s'achève, mais le débat est loin d'être terminé. 2 mois d'audience marqués par de nombreux dysfonctionnements et de nombreux rebondissements.
Police, bonjour. Vous devez venir. C'est urgent. Les enfants sont en danger. Vous devez envoyer quelqu'un tout de suite. Dites-moi où vous vous trouvez. Êtes-vous en sécurité? À Outreau. Ils sont maltraités, ils sont forcés. Vous comprenez pas? C'est grave. Ils sont pas en sécurité. Qui leur fait du mal? Décrivez-moi la situation. Non mais c'est pas juste ici. C'est partout. C'est pire que ce que vous croyez. S'il vous plaît, envoyez quelqu'un vite. Restez en ligne. On envoie de l'aide.
Our story begins in Outreau, in northern France, a working-class neighborhood known as the Tour du Renard. In this neighborhood, there were large apartment blocks named after birds.
Le procès s'achève, mais le débat est loin d'être
It
terminé.
seemed completely innocent, with salt of the earth families just trying to make their way through life. But in February 2001, this neighborhood that had flown under the radar for so long was thrust into the spotlight.
Walk on, walk on, walk on, walk on. When all is said and done, when all is said and done, walk on, walk on, walk on, walk on. When all is said and done.
The case started with 4 children, all of whom were reporting something very, very disturbing. Now, the case didn't start off all that odd. Police often did respond to instances of abuse on a child by a parent. However, the police had no idea how far this case was going to go and the ramifications that it would have on the future of the justice system. The victims were the DeLay children. One little boy, Jonathan DeLay, was 5 years old at the time. He had been taken out of the custody of his parents, and his new caregivers and the minders at his school had noticed some strange behavior from a child so young. But before we go to the beginning of the investigation, let me take you to where this all started, the Renard block. The Renard block was a large concrete structure housing multiple families. In one unit, Unit 20 on the 6th floor, there lived the DeLay Badawi family. This was a large family consisting of 4 kids and their parents, Miriam and Thierry. Now, Jonathan was the middle child, with 2 older brothers and 1 younger brother who was only 2 years old at the time of the incident. All of the kids were under the age of 9 years old when this all began. Jonathan's home was much like every other on his block. It was filled with the same wallpaper and fashionings, except for one closet in the living room. Now, this closet was filled with something very strange. Human skulls. Jonathan's father, Thierry, was a collector of sorts. It was one of his many fixations. One of his other fixations was pornography, and he was not shy about it. He would often have it playing in the TV in the living room, sometimes with the sound off, sometimes with the sound on, and he didn't care if the kids saw it. He liked it. He even encouraged it. Even then, Thierry was described as a sick man. He would regularly punish his children by ripping the wooden slats off of the bed and using them to beat them. He also liked to scare his kids by putting on a white mask and a cape. And at night, after they had gone to sleep, he would burst into their rooms yelling just because he wanted to. He never really gave an explanation for his actions. But it wasn't just Thierry who took part in these exploits. Miriam, Jonathan's mother, was also there for all of the abuse, and sometimes even took part in it. When Miriam was away from Thierry, she would often switch it up, becoming the kind and loving mother that every child would want. But when Thierry was around, she would let him do as he pleased. The only good thing that Miriam ever did for her children was by calling social services in February of 2001, when the abuse just got too bad for them to handle. It was then that Jonathan and his siblings went to go live in foster care. By then, 5-year-old Jonathan was so psychologically scarred that when his foster parents asked him if he wanted to watch cartoons, he responded saying that he wanted to watch porn videos. Realizing that their foster kid had some pretty dark thoughts, They encouraged him to tell them what had happened in Unit 20. They said it was a safe space and that no one would ever hurt him like that again. So Jonathan told them, and the nightmare began. Jonathan confessed to his foster parents and his daycare provider that when Thierry and Miriam would have sex, they would force him and his siblings to watch porn. He also confessed that Thierry would sodomize him. He struggled to put it into words and could only use the words of his understanding at the age. He told them what his father would do to his pee-pee and that it was too big. But it wasn't just Jonathan who endured this. His older siblings were raped too. Thankfully, his youngest brother had been spared. Jonathan also said that his mother Miriam would film Thierry when he raped the boys. Jonathan, even at such a young age, already had a concept of shame, and he had a tough time talking about the abuse. Psychologists and legal experts, when they sat down and interviewed Jonathan, they just noticed how reluctant he was to talk about what had happened to him, and would often draw pictures. To them, this was a sign of credibility, as shame often goes hand in hand with such suffering. When the allegations came to light, an examining magistrate named Fabrice Burgot was tasked with interrogating Jonathan and the other kids mentioned in the testimony. It was going to be a tough investigation, as it was one person's word against another. And it wasn't unheard of for kids to add to a story just to be believed. But there was no doubt that the 4 children had been exposed to something early on, and that their levels of hypersexuality were just not normal. Experts were brought in to test whether the delayed children were credible, and their realities were questioned, and their pathological tendencies to tell stories. Marie-Christine Grison was a psychologist tasked with the examinations, as questions of credibility were brought up by Fabrice Burgot. Now, this was normal in a case of this magnitude, as it had to be queried. Were the kids really telling the truth? Did the abuse ever really occur? When Marie-Christine met the children, she was shocked. Throughout her career, she had met hundreds of child abuse victims, but what the delayed children were reporting was unimaginable. After the children gave their statements, Thierry and Miriam were taken into custody, and their apartment was searched and photographed. It was there that police found over 160 pornography videos, several large dildos in a briefcase in the living room, and 10 human skulls that were in the closet. Now, naturally, police looked into Thierry's criminal record and found that he had been convicted of desecration of graves in 1993. So it was most likely that those skulls were 100% real and probably stolen. Now, police also found videotapes, one of which that showed Thierry and Miriam having sex in front of a child. Now, Burgot interviewed Thierry, who denied all of the accusations that his children had leveled against him. However, there was enough evidence found inside of the home to charge him. Miriam initially denied the accusations, but shortly after, she asked to see Burgot, and it was then that she confessed that Thierry had abused the kids and that she had participated. She said she didn't know why she did it and offered a vague excuse that being exposed to that much porn is enough to make anyone go crazy. A hearing was held in the wake of the confessions, in which Miriam confirmed what the children had said. But she added another bombshell, and this one was completely unexpected. She said that there were others involved in the abuse, and that men would come to Unit 20 to rape the kids. And these weren't just random men coming in from the streets. No, these were family friends and neighbors who had watched the kids grow up. Miriam gave up the names willingly. Franck Lavière, Sandrine Lavière, Thierry Desquet, Aurélie Grenin, and David Deplanque, all of whom lived in the same neighborhood. On March 6th, the suspects were rounded up, arrested, and taken to different police precincts to be questioned. Now, one of the accused, David Deplanque, immediately sought legal representation, and he got Fabienne Roy-Nanchin, who was assigned to his case. Now, David said that he had not done any of the things that he was charged with, and that him and his girlfriend, Aurélie Grenin, had only had a few pre-dinner drinks with the delays, and then he'd see them occasionally. However, what David didn't know was that Aurelie had told them a completely different story. She had confirmed everything that Miriam had said. When confronted with this, David said, well, if Aurelie says so, then it's true. It was a bizarre situation. Now, Aurelie and David, they were young and good-looking, the complete opposite of Thierry and Miriam. And what else did these couples have in common? How did they even end up in the same social situations? Now, Fabienne had a theory that maybe alcohol opened up the floodgates to something more sinister, and things just kind of spiraled out of control. And it turns out that is exactly what happened. So little by little, the story began to unravel. And David had a hearing with a senior police officer at the Boulogne precinct, where he began to tell him how everything took place. At first, the couples would just have sex, each with their own partner. And then they started to have sex all together, sometimes switching partners. And then Thierry would bring the kids in to take part, sometimes playfully, other times by force. David's next words are hard to comprehend because they just don't quite make any sense. He said that him and Aurelie got carried away when Thierry would grope the kids in front of him and have them perform oral sex. Thierry would also sodomize the kids in front of David, and he described it as a sick game that he got caught up in at the encouragement of Thierry and Miriam. It was sick and depraved and unbelievable. How does something like that even cross somebody's mind? How can that ever be seen as entertainment? David and Aurelie went on to confirm the names of the other suspects that Miriam had mentioned, also former neighbors and residents of Outreau. It began with former neighbors David Brunet and Corinne Duchessois, Francois Mormont, who had a child with one of the Delay's neighbors, also a godfather to one of the Delay children, and Christian Godard and his wife Rosalind, also known as the Outreau baker. These indictments weren't based off of statements alone, or so officials claimed. Now, allegedly, there was other evidence to suggest foul play, yet this evidence was never fully disclosed even after the trial was finished. So it really does beg the question, did this evidence ever actually exist? As more suspects were taken into custody and more names came out, rumors began to swirl around Outreau, and their residents started to wonder, did everybody in the Renard block take part in the abuse? Or maybe even the whole neighborhood? Journalists began to swarm the small settlement, and numerous reports were printed, but at the time, mostly all of it was speculation. Now, there was one reporter, Laurent Renard, who actually went to the Renard block with a colleague. Now, they went up to the 6th floor to Unit 20, and they knocked to see if anyone was home. Now, a neighbor stuck their head out and said, "They're not here." Now, what Laurent got from this was that in the Renard block, the sound carried. So if there had been violent crimes or abuse happening in Unit 20, everybody would have heard. Which begs the question, was everyone in on it? In June, the children accused new people who didn't even live in Le Tour de Renard, such as Pierre Martel, the local taxi driver, Odile Marescu, Alain Marescu, and Dominique Ville, a local priest. People began to wonder, just how far did this go? Clearly, it wasn't just Outreau, so how far had it spread and who was next? In November, the story made national headlines, and all of the suspects were named. Added to the list were Daniel Legrand Sr. and his son Daniel Legrand Jr. Now, the public was outraged as all of the suspects were brought before the magistrates. Now, the most shocking was the alleged crimes committed by Odile Marescu and Alain Marescu because of their professions. Now, Alain was a court bailiff and Odile was a nurse, and they lived in a lavish home in the Bologna countryside. By all accounts, they lived a comfortable life and were in a completely different social class than the Delays. They also had kids who were around the same age as the Delays' children. After they were named as suspects, Virgo ordered a raid on their home. Now, on the morning of the raid, the kids were taken away from Odile and Alain, and Odile was heartbroken. Little did she know that it would be 3 years before they were reunited again. So far, there were 17 adults charged, with only 3 admitting guilt and the rest claiming innocence. But ultimately, 50 people would be investigated. Now, this case attracted a lot of attention, with prominent and skilled lawyers in France, who were arguing that there was no tangible evidence. Some of the heavy hitters were Frank Burton, who was defending Odile Marescue, and Herbert Delarue, who was defending Alain Marescue. Both attorneys felt that the charges were absolutely ridiculous. Now, the accusations were that Odile and Alain had been a part of a sex ring that was orchestrated by the Delays and had raped the Delay children. Now, Odile denied the accusations, and she even said that she didn't know the Delay family. Odile thought that she would be believed. She thought that they would want to hear what she had to say, but it would only get worse from here on out. Police had a link. Alain had been to the Renard block before. Dossiers in Alain's office detailed Thierry's debt, meaning that undoubtedly Alain had been to Unit 20 at some point to collect that debt. As the investigation continued, a dozen more children started to make accusations similar to that of the Delay children. Now, the youngest was only a few months old, and the oldest was 14. Now, some of these children even went to the same school as the Delay kids. Their testimonies were deemed credible, and as the pressure mounted, the list of children making accusations went all the way up to 24. No one was safe from being accused. Alain's children were interviewed, and his youngest child did say that his father would touch him when Odile wasn't around. But Alain said that they would just play games like kissing and cuddling, but none of it was of a sexual nature. As the denials continued from the majority of the suspects, Miriam maintained her accusations against, well, everyone. But the facts had to be corroborated. So a witness confrontation was set up and a hearing was held containing each of the defendants along with their legal representation. During the hearing, Miriam, David Duplanc, and Dorelli were all in agreement, pointing the finger at each and every defendant present and confirming their identities. It was going to be the case of the century, led by Birgo and, well, Miriam, who had named about 25 people and had really set the tone for the whole trial. The other lawyers started to suspect that Miriam was simply just telling Birgo what he wanted to hear. Now, to them, there was not a lot of evidence against most of the defendants, except for really just accusations. But Birgo was hearing what he wanted to hear, and he wanted to believe Miriam. After all, he was a young judge trying to make his mark on the world. This case would be his magnum opus. Now, Miriam, while in detention, would continuously write Birgo letters asking to be summoned. Now, he agreed, and during a hearing, Miriam said that she could tell him how the ring started. Now, it all went back to Christmas time of 1996, with a man down the street from the Renard block. The man allegedly sold porn, and Miriam claimed that he wanted to start a child molesting business. According to Miriam, Thierry would earn a small amount of cash by providing the man with photos and videos of the delayed children with other adults. Now, Miriam told Birgo that many adults were paying for this pornographic material, but she couldn't name them. Now, the man allegedly sold porn, and Miriam said that he wanted to start a child molesting business. Now, according to Miriam, Thierry would earn small portions of cash by giving the man photos and videos of the delayed children with other adults. Miriam said that many people were paying for this pornographic material, but she couldn't name them. As Birgo listened, it became incredibly clear to legal experts, especially Fabian, that Miriam was really drawing Birgo in. She knew what he wanted and she was giving it to him, and the case really relied on her testimony alone. It was her word with no guaranteed outcome. Now, Birgo's job was to find the truth with no procedural errors, an impossible task that he would ultimately fail. After a few months in custody, Miriam wrote Birgo another letter about her trips to Belgium. She was again brought in to divulge this new information. Now, she accused Daniel Legrand Sr. and Daniel Legrand Jr. of owning a sex shop in Belgium. She said that her and the kids would be brought to a private house of a family member of the Legrands in Bellevarde. There, in a small room with nothing but a video camera, the delayed children would be made to pose with the adults. Now, Miriam knew that by mentioning Belgium, she would be making the case international, and the media frenzy would only increase. But Birgo thought that the testimony was credible, as the Legrands had already been named by the children. When questioned again about Belgium, the children remembered being taken there in a Martel taxi. Now, one child remembered being taken to a farm on the Belgian countryside. Now, this farm had lots of animals. The child said that the adults would rape the animals. This consisted of goats, pigs, cats, dogs, and horses. The adults would then rape the children, and then force the children to have intercourse with the animals. Another child echoed this, and even said that the incidents were filmed. It just got more and more grotesque by the minute. With these new allegations, Belgian authorities located 2 farms matching the children's descriptions. They brought some of the kids, as well as the delayed children, to these farms, but none of them could resolutely say which one was the right one. Either memories had faded, or they just looked too similar. Either way, nothing really came of the lead. No photos, no evidence, nothing but allegations. Journalists focus on the suspects, especially those who are easily identifiable, like Odile and Alain Marescu. And the majority of the suspects remained in detention, despite the lack of evidence against them. And the only way for them to be released was by Birgo, or by the investigating chamber's approval. But no one was going to go against Birgo, not with the magnitude of the case that they were facing. And Birgo felt emboldened by this power. He felt validated and supported, and he felt right in his decision. He had absolute control. But to the suspects who were maintaining their innocence, it seemed like Birgo couldn't care less about what they had to say. He just deferred to Miriam. Now, to the legal experts who were working on the defense or anyone close to the case, it didn't seem like Birgo was in pursuit of the whole truth, but just one side of it. Odile Marescu had numerous hearings with him and was constantly brushed aside and her statements ignored. She didn't know the delayed children, and she constantly tried to tell this to the authorities. Now that the investigators had found that link between him and the delays, they were gunning for prosecution. Not to mention his son had made that damning accusation against him. Birgo wanted to find him and all of the defendants guilty. But according to Birgo, Alain and Odile had been implicated by 2 of the delayed children and 3 adults. Aurélie Grenon, who had already admitted her guilt, allegedly knew details about the couple's involvement, such as the type of underwear that Odile would wear and that the couple was always dressed smartly. Another detail was that one of the delayed children knew one of the Marescu children, yet had never been to their house. When interviewed, the child did recognize some parts of the house, and even one particular rug. How is that possible when they had never been there? According to Birgo, Alain and Odile had been implicated by 2 of the delayed children and 3 adults. Aurélie Grenon, who had already admitted her guilt, knew details about the couple's involvement. She knew what underwear Odile would wear, and even said that the couple always dressed smartly. Another detail was that one of the delayed children knew one of the Marescu children, but had never been to their house. However, when the child was questioned, they recognized parts of the house and even one particular rug. But how is that possible if they'd never been there? When it came to evidence, Birgo basically drew up 2 columns, one of inculpatory evidence and one of exculpatory evidence. Now, inculpatory evidence basically indicates guilt, whereas exculpatory indicates innocence. Essentially, it was a giant list of pros and cons. But perception was never really taken into account. Since we were dealing with mostly accusations, human factors such as exaggeration and lapse in judgment needed to be factored in. To prosecute a case, you need hard evidence, and Birgo didn't really have that. But nevertheless, the case continued. In December 2001, Daniel LeGrand Jr. went to a witness confrontation with David DePlanck, Aurelie, and Miriam. Now, the charges were that he had raped the children, inserted objects inside of them, and filmed it. All with his father, Daniel LeGrand Sr. But he swore that he was innocent. He didn't know David, Aurelie, or Miriam. But despite his protests, he was thrown in jail and eventually into solitary confinement for his own protection. On the 19th of December, he met with the examining magistrate and said something unbelievable. He confessed. He said that he had raped the children. He'd done it. He even named more people while he was at it. Odile, Alain, even a man named Francois Marmont. But it was strange. There was no other connection to Daniel and the Marescus. So why would he name them if he didn't even know them? Either they were involved or the prosecution was just in a big rush to prosecute. This was a bombshell confession, and it was just one of the many surprises to come. In January 2002, Daniel LeGrand Jr. wrote to a French publication talking about how he had witnessed the murder of a young Belgian girl at the Delay apartment. He said at the end of 1999, a girl was raped and beaten to death at the Delay apartment, and he pointed the finger at Thierry Delay, Miriam, and a Belgian man who had brought the girl there. He also said that Francois Marmont witnessed the whole thing. Virgo eventually got a hold of the letter that Daniel had written, and he summoned Miriam to see if these allegations were correct. But this was a grave mistake. Virgo simply just read the letter out loud to her, without even asking any questions. He just handed her all of the details. And of course, Miriam was happy to confirm what Daniel LeGrand had said. She even went so far as to give details about what the little girl looked like, what her hairstyle was like, what sweatpants she was wearing on the night of. She even described the rape in great detail. And it was so grotesque that it brought even hardened criminal lawyers to tears. Jonathan Delay had heard about this new allegation, and after he'd listened to the broadcast, he told his foster parents that he remembered the little girl. He had seen her that night. He'd heard a noise, and when he looked under his bed, he saw her body there, rolled up. He screamed, and Thierry came in the room, but he wasn't fazed by it. He just said that Jonathan had to help him bury the little girl, so he did, in the Outreau community gardens. Authorities interviewed other children about these details, and all of their statements aligned perfectly. So a search was carried out of the Outreau community gardens. The whole area was excavated, and the team just kept digging and digging and digging all through the night and into the next morning. But they found nothing. So the question had to be raised. Did this little girl ever even exist? And if she did, had she been moved? After searching the whole area thoroughly and going over 100 square meters, the excavation was called off. And all we were left with was more questions. In February of 2002, Daniel LeGrand Jr. was called in front of the magistrate once again. Now, he was questioned, but this time around, he looked visibly uncomfortable, and he asked to take a break. While outside with his lawyer, he burst into tears and uttered 6 unbelievable words. I made the whole thing up. I made the whole thing up. The murder had been made up. The network of abusers had been made up. He said he didn't even know the other suspects. He said that him and his father were innocent. So why lie? Why confess to something that you didn't do? According to Daniel LeGrand's sister, his motive was to shake up the justice system, to send them on a wild goose chase and show police that nothing that they had was credible. But his main motive was to trap Miriam, and she fell right into it. But unfortunately, things did not work out the way that Daniel wanted. Virgo figured that Daniel didn't have the level of Machiavellism to pull off something like that. Virgo thought that Daniel was either manipulated and coached by someone, or the allegations were true. Either way, things had severely spiraled out of hand, and the only option was to examine every single person's testimony and compare it against what Miriam had alleged. The legal team questioned Miriam again and again, and each time she told a different story. She had some major inconsistencies, and it became clear that she was not a credible source, and that Birgo lacked objectivity when it came to Miriam. It was true that she had made him her ally. Whether he knew it or not, no one could be sure. On June 9th, 2002, a tragedy occurred. Francois Marmont died by suicide while imprisoned. He was in a state of despair, with all of his requests to be released being denied. He couldn't face the ruin that these allegations had caused on his life, and right up to the end, he maintained his innocence. Alain Marescu had also made a suicide attempt and would eventually go on a hunger strike. Dominique Ville, the priest who was accused of sexually abusing the children, also went on a hunger strike. It was clear that the house was collapsing, and to the outsiders looking in, this was a sloppy investigation and a sham. On May 4th, 2004, the Outreau trials began in Saint-Omer. There were 17 suspects being charged with the rape of 18 children. This was the biggest trial that France had seen in years, and it had the most implications. There was a network of pedophiles at large, or the justice system and the measures that it had put in place were wildly inadequate. During the first week of the trial, there was a massive crowd. Everyone wanted to catch a glimpse of the monsters, many of whom entered the courtroom covering their faces. It had been 3 years since the investigation started. 3 years of hell for everyone involved. France's most highly skilled lawyers swarmed the courthouse, ready for a spectacle, one of whom was Eric Dupont-Moretti, also known as the Acquitter. Now, he was representing Rosalind Godard, also known as the Baker of Outreau. Now, him and all of the other lawyers were in agreement that the presumption of innocence was way out the window, and they were ready for a fight. There were two opposing sides in terms of the accused: those who admitted to it and those who maintained their innocence. Now, it was the defense's job to poke holes in the testimonies of the accusers. That even included the children. The prosecution was relying heavily on the children's testimony, so they had to find a way to make sure that they weren't credible. But how are they going to do that? On the first day of the trial, the presiding judge, Judge Monnier, started by examining each of the defendants' personality, whether they had a tendency to be dishonest or manipulate others, or if they were even a valuable member of society. Basically, each defendant stood before the court and told their life story. Miriam's childhood could only be described as horrifying. Since childhood, she had been abused, raped, battered, and even sold into prostitution. When it came to all the defendants, there was not one common personality trait. So it was really up to the judge to decide who here was a sexual predator. And how does one do that? How do you peer behind the mask? Miriam had admitted to being a monster, but her role went far beyond that. Now, she had cast all of these people in a play of her own making, and she loved her role in the courtroom. She loved being the center of attention. It was probably the first time in her whole life. And the entire case, it relied on her. But the defense, they were certain that Miriam had lied. The question became, why? What was the justification for it? One tactic that the defense used was to get the message out in the press by having all the defendants proclaim their innocence to reporters in front of the courthouse. Now, this would potentially influence the jurors, who would no doubt be following this case in the news and reading about it in the papers. And it did have an effect. The idea that Miriam was a liar and a manipulator began to take hold in the press. In the second week of the trial, interrogations began, and Thierry faced a cross-examination. Now, at first, he maintained his innocence, proclaiming that he didn't do anything. He said that he was an alcoholic who often faced memory problems when he binged. But the attorneys weren't going to let him get away that easy. They pressed, and finally, Thierry cracked down and admitted to raping his children 2 to 3 times a week. Now the prosecution had 4 admissions of guilt, but Thierry denied the involvement of Rosalind Godard, Dominique Ville, Pierre Martel, and Alain and Odile Marescu. He said that they had not taken part in any of it. He also cleared the rest of the defendants, apart from Aurélie, David, and Miriam. He cleared every single other co-defendant. When Miriam was cross-examined, she maintained all of her original accusations, Even when she was questioned for 8 hours, she was relentless, determined to stick to her statements. Now, when Miriam was on the stand, she painted herself as a caring mother, determined to do the right thing. But she also admitted to raping her children and enjoying it. So she was a complete paradox. Outreau took the stand to speak about her co-defendants, and she maintained all of the accusations that Miriam and the children had made. It was strange. Outreau had been out on bail. Even though she had admitted to participating in the rapes of the children, she had only served about 3 months, while other defendants who had maintained their innocence with very little evidence against them were still behind bars. Had Outreau been released because she had named all of the right people? All of the people that Birgo deemed guilty? Had he rewarded her for this with her freedom? The trial stretched into its 3rd week and the children began to testify. Now, it was rare for children to testify in public, but with the adults' statements contradicting each other so heavily, there really was no other option. The children were terrified, most of whom hadn't seen their parents in 3 years. Now, the defense had to be careful. They had to make sure that the children seemed uncredible, poke holes in their story, but they had to do so without traumatizing them. Jonathan DeLay was made to testify, and he named the following defendants: Father Dominique, Rosalind Godard, David Duplanc, Aurélie Grenon, and Thierry Dusquet. He also said that the women were different from the men, that they used tools like hammers and screwdrivers and spoon handles. He also mentioned the little girl who he claimed had been murdered in the apartment. But the defense, they didn't buy it, especially attorney Dupont Moretti, who insisted that this was all fabricated and disturbing delusion. Now, there was a shift in the trial. Dupont Moretti had placed doubt in the children's testimonies. Now, Jonathan's brother was also meant to testify, and he accused the original 17, but also named an additional 30. Attorney Herbert Delarue confronted him, and he even bent down to his level. Now, he started asking just casual questions, but then they became laser focused, and he started to poke holes in the boy's story. He questioned how he could have been raped by all of these people, how he could have been raped on the farm by all of these animals. Each question was worse than the last, but the boy confirmed each monstrous detail. Attorney Herbert Delarue confronted him and even bent down to his level. Now, he began by asking casual questions, but then they became laser focused. He was trying to poke holes in the boy's story, asking how he could have been raped by so many people and by all of these animals on the farm like he claimed. Question after question, the boy confirmed every single monstrous detail. The question had to be floated. Was this just the fantasies of hypersexualized kids who had been exposed to too much at too young of an age? As the questions continued, the boy began to crack under pressure, but the defense, they were not letting up. No, they were going in for the kill. At one point during the interrogation, Miriam began screaming and crying for Delarue to stop. She couldn't bear to see her child so distressed. And then she stood up and she cleared everyone. She told the court that she had lied about everything. She pointed to each defendant, cleared their name, and started begging for their forgiveness. There was nothing for the court to do except for take a recess. And as the defendants began to exit, they were crying, some out of relief, but others for what they had already lost. Many of them had lost their homes, their jobs, their families, all because of one woman's lies. Aurélie also confessed that she too had lied. She had made the whole thing up. She was just following Miriam's lead. No one saw it coming, and it truly turned the entire case on its head. Now the court needed to take action against Aurélie and Miriam, and the rest of the 13 defendants became known as the Innocent 13, or the Outreau Innocents, after having their lives completely shattered. But how did this happen? The day after Miriam recanted her claims, she said that some of the accusations had been fed to her by Birgo, by him asking leading questions, and by him telling her to just name more names. It was a legal scandal, and what most experts had already suspected. 19, 2002, at the National Assembly, the Minister of Justice was called to answer for the destruction of the lives of the 13 innocent. Now, he said that an immediate investigation into how this could have all occurred was to begin. The fourth week of the trial, motions to release the 7 still incarcerated defendants was introduced. Now, this included Daniel LeGrand Jr. and Dominique Ville, who had been in detention for 30 months, Pierre Martel, who had also been in detention for 30 months, and Daniel LeGrand Sr., who had also been in detention for 30 months. Now, these monsters were now being viewed as victims, and this unlocked a new fear. This could happen to anyone. But a release didn't mean an acquittal, and the trial was far from over. But the tides had turned, and suddenly Burgot found himself at the center of everything once again. Now, Burgot took the stand, and the defense argued that his investigation was biased. Burgot maintained that the indictments were simply based on evidence. He was cold and technical and devoid of all emotions. He seemed like he didn't owe anyone anything. He said that he was a technical person, and that the miscarriage of justice and the suicide, these were all technical errors. Burgot felt that he didn't have to explain himself. In the 5th week, the children testified, and they named other names apart from the main 4 perpetrators. One of the names that was brought up again was Father Dominique Ville. One child, a 15-year-old named Jean Marie, named Thierry Delay, and said that he had raped him and taped it. But the defense wouldn't tolerate this, believing it to be yet another lie. Every defendant's legal representation pulled together. Some of the greatest legal minds in France were all working together as one, and they came up with a scorched of the earth approach. Get Marie Grisson, the psychologist who had first cleared the children, on the stand. She had found the 17 children credible, and now it was her turn to be cross-examined. Dupont-Moretti launched the attack and pronounced her as a person who puts people in jail. The children had told Grisson that she had been assaulted by 3 men at the same time, namely Franck Levier, Thierry Delay, and David Deplanque. Now, Franck and Sandrine Levier's own child had accused them of abuse. Grisson had said that the little girl's testimony was credible, but while she stood on the stand, the defense started to pick apart her findings and dropped a major bombshell. Now, the little girl in question had been examined by a gynecologist after her statements, and it was found that her hymen was still intact. She was still a virgin. Now, there was also no signs of any traumatic penetration. Now, in light of this, Grisson's expert opinion held little to no weight in court, and the prosecution called for 10 of the 17 accused to still be convicted. They believed that there was enough evidence. But on the other hand, the defense believed the opposite. They said that they had demonstrated that the statements weren't credible. The jury deliberated for over 15 hours, and everyone waited, not knowing how the case was going to turn out. Finally, at 12 a.m., the decision was made. David Brunet, Corinne Duchessois, Rosalind Godard, Christian Godard, Pierre Martel, Odile Marescou, and Daniel Legrand Sr. were all acquitted. In total, there were 10 convictions, 6 of which were against defendants who still maintained their innocence. Even after the verdict was read, there was still confusion and doubt and lack of clarity. Thierry Delay was sentenced to 20 years and Miriam to 15. David Deplanque received a 6-year sentence and Aurelie a 4-year sentence. Alain Marescou also received an 18-month suspended sentence. Then there was the more confusing verdict. Thierry Dusquet received 4 years, while Daniel Legrand Jr. received 3 years. Franck Levier received 6 years, and Dominique Ville 7 years. Now, there was a mixed response from the public, because a rape charge was about 15 years minimum. So if there was enough to convict, then why were these sentences so short? There seemed to be no explanation for these convictions. Who was the justice system actually protecting? And as word spread, the families of the convicted began to protest outside of the court. In September of 2004, the 7 who were acquitted met with the Attorney General and received a formal apology from the minister. But what about the others? It would be over a year, in November of 2005, before the 6 convicted would appear before the court again, hoping to have their sentences overturned. The children who had originally testified, including the delayed children, were brought back in for the second trial. But this time, journalists were not allowed to witness their testimonies. It was going to be another terrifying ordeal for the children, and one of the delayed children was so nervous to be back in court that they actually attempted suicide. But the trial went on. There was no escaping it. The testimonies were read again, and it was clear that the statements were vague at best. The children who had accused Dominique Ville of abuse ultimately recanted their statements and admitted that they had lied about it. A boy called Olivier admitted that he was just copying what everybody else at school was saying. It was a huge turning point in the case. If they had lied about Ville, what else had they lied about? For example, the Lavière child had accused 3 men of raping her, but had no wounds or physical trauma present on her body. Franck Lavière did admit that he would sniff his daughter's genitals after they bathed, just to be hygienic. While this is sexual assault, it is not the depravity that the child had claimed. Unfortunately, they were not prosecuting Lavière for sexual assault, but for the mass rape of numerous underage children. So legally, in this case, the assault didn't matter. The little girl was so traumatized, but she couldn't seem to explain in legal terms what had happened to her. Alain Marescu's son took the stand, and it was clear that he was unstable. He had accused Alain of molestation, but when he was brought up on the stand again, he backtracked. He said that it was all just a misunderstanding. How had all of the children formulated such stories? How had they all been misunderstood? The question of how the children were interrogated came up. Maybe they were asked suggestive questions. Maybe they were all just trying to please the adults who were asking them. After years of wondering, a common link was potentially found. Many of the children were in foster homes that shared one particular commonality. The children all went to the same schools and got to know each other. The child care providers also got to know each other, and they would compare notes on what the children had said. The child care providers had began the interrogations. They would hear a story from another child care provider and go to the child to see if it was true. It was like a game of broken down telephone. The final day of the trial, the closing arguments were heard, and the proceedings happened behind closed doors. Everyone expected an acquittal of all 6 defendants. The trial had been a tragedy, with layer upon layer of mistakes. So would now it finally all be over? Before the verdict was formally announced to the public, Yvan Spot, the Attorney General, had a press conference inside of the courtroom. Now, this had never been done before, at least not before the verdict had been read. During this press conference, Bott formally apologized on behalf of the French population for all the mistakes made by the justice system. It was the final mea culpa, and he hoped that it would work. On December 1st, 2005, the rest of the defendants emerged from the courtroom exonerated. The Outreau affair was finally over, and each of the wrongfully accused received a settlement from the French state up to several €100,000. But this was not enough to make up for what they had already lost. It was also found that 12 of the 18 children had been abused, and they were also compensated. Then there was the issue of Birgo. After all, he was the focal point of this whole mess. A parliamentary committee was set up in February of 2006, and an inquiry was held to implement reforms on the judicial system. Birgo was summoned to the hearing to testify before the committee. He was the face of absolute failure. Now, this was a televised hearing, being broadcast nationwide with all the French citizens tuning in. And Birgo did seem weary. He said that he empathized with the victims. But he also maintained the same stance as before, that he had no regrets. He was just doing his job. And unfortunately, he only received a reprimand, which was the lowest form of disciplinary action. It was a slap in the face to the Outreau innocents. But the story wasn't entirely over. Years later, in February of 2012, Franck and Sandrine Levier were sentenced to 10 and 8 months for the habitual violence against their children. In November of 2023, Franck was also finally held responsible for the actions against his daughter and was sentenced to 6 months in prison. But what about the key players in our case? Miriam Badawi Delay was released back in 2015, but was sent back for theft and writing bad checks. Thierry Delay was also released from prison back in 2016, but he was sent back once again for sexual abuse charges. Jonathan Delay still maintains that there was a little girl who was murdered right in front of him and who he helped bury. Jonathan also maintains that all of the accused in the Outreau trial are guilty. The Outreau affair leaves a haunting legacy and a reminder of the devastating power of wrongful accusations. An entire town was plunged into chaos, and its fabric was torn apart by suspicion and fear. Families were shattered and irreparably damaged, and there is still a specter of doubt lingering on those who survived. Despite the exonerations, the scars of Outreau run deep, etched into the memories of the community forever. The judicial system, which should have been a pillar of justice, was now an instrument of tragedy. While the courtroom had shut its doors to this dark chapter, the echoes of injustice could still be felt. For the people of Outreau, and for the rest of us, the fear of being wrongfully accused was no longer just a nightmare, but a lived reality that was never going away. But the fallout of Outreau was not just a miscarriage of justice. It was a betrayal to those who really needed it. Real victims of abuse now face an even steeper hill, and their stories might be less likely to be believed. Their trauma might be dismissed, as the fear of what happened in Outreau could happen again. The tragedy of Outreau extends far beyond the courtroom and ripples into the lives of real victims, who will now wonder, will I be believed, or will I too become a casualty of a justice system that failed so spectacularly?